Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm pleased to be joined again in the virtual studio here by Lyman Stone. Lyman, thanks for joining.
My pleasure. Always good to be with you.
Lyman Stone is an economist, he's a demographer, he's a Lutheran, hence the title of our conversation today. He's from the great state of Kentucky, and I believe that you are now in the Great White North of Canada, completing a PhD is it in Montreal? You're in Montreal, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So you're not surrounded on all sides by hostile truckers or anything right now.
No. I don't know if there has been any like trucker protest in Montreal. I guess there was something in Quebec City. I don't know how big it was, but no.
No, I don't know. Well, the idea of
I don't
blocking
know that
traffic.
I don't know that there is a right wing in Montreal.
No.
So
Well, I was gonna say the idea of like truckers or people with like tractors blocking the road seems very French, but
it does, right? I feel like they could get into that, but
Yeah.
but maybe that's why it's not happening in Montreal, is because this is the city that isn't quite French enough for Quebec. So
There you go.
yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks for joining. And I wanted to talk to you about Lutheranism because the last time I made a bunch of questions about Lutheranism, but we talked so much about falling birth rates that we never got to it. You study a lot about demographics. You're very good on migration, very good on sort of family formation, family statistics. And you're also really into religious statistics and religious history of the United States and histories of denominations, particularly Lutheranism. So I thought it would be good to talk about it from your perspective, because like most Americans who aren't Lutherans, even most American Protestants, we know the term Lutheran, we see the Lutheran church on the block, but probably don't know all that much about Lutheranism. When I moved to New York City in 2014, the end of 2014, I realized that I had never been to a Lutheran service. I had been to, my family is Catholic on both sides, so I'd been to Catholic masses, I'd been to Episcopal services, I'd been to Methodist, I'd been to Baptist, I'd been to Presbyterian. I'd been to almost all of them, but I had never been to a Lutheran service. And so I went to a couple of different Lutheran churches just to check it out. One of which was in the ELCA, and in which we'll talk about more about these denominations, and the other one which was in the Missouri Synod. And so I had a little exposure through that. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily know that much about Lutherans. So the first question is, and I'll just stress, neither of us are theologians, so we may talk a little theology, but this isn't intended to be a theological treatise. What is Lutheranism?
It's the truest form of Christianity, of course.
Okay.
But no. That's I'm contractually obligated to
Well,
provide
I would
that
hope
answer.
if you're part of a denomination that you believe that its teachings are true.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No. So I mean, if you think about like kind of the family tree of Christianity, you start, of course, with the Apostolic Church, right, in Acts, and then you immediately start to get divisions, right? And so the book of Acts is largely a story of those divisions, and how the church is dividing or staying together or kind of figuring out what it means to be a church body. And then the epistles, as you read on in the Bible, you can see that like there are groups forming. So you get some early offshoot groups that, well, there's debate on if they're offshoots or if they're other cults that just picked up Christian language, things like the Gnostics. You get some you get some interaction with the religion of Manichaeanism for a while. There's debate about how to situate all these movements with each other. But the first really big distinctive Christian schism is with the Arians, who they don't believe that Jesus is originally God, co-equal with the Father, so to speak. They're non-Trinitarian in that sense, and so there's a big fight over if they're Christian or not. The side that says this belief is not acceptable wins, and they write the Nicene Creed as a method of basically keeping the Arians out. You get later creeds that keep other groups out. You start to get some split-offs. So Arianism basically died out as a teaching. But other beliefs like other kinds of monophysitism survived. So you see some of that in the Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches in Egypt and Ethiopia. You see some of that in the Armenian church. Various versions of mono or miaphysitism that, while not strictly Arian, they're not Arians. They're not. I should be very clear. They're not Arians. They actually broke over a different disagreement. But you start to get these schisms forming that persist to this day. So you get these offshoots, geographically distant offshoots. So also the Oriental Orthodox or Assyrian Orthodox churches break off here as well. And this gets us up through like the 600s, 700s, 800s, this area. So then what happens next? For a while, the church kind of has unity. Now, there's cracks under the surface between the Eastern Church, that's the Greek-speaking church in Constantinople, and the Latin-speaking church in Rome. But the balance holds for a while, and they're all, nominally a church. They've got some differences, but nominally a church. And then you get the reformist movement in the Latin church. And I'm sorry, this is a long story, but I promise it has a punchline here. And the reform movement is basically saying it's in some sense the first shot at a reformation. And it's led by Popes Urban and Gregory in particular. And basically they say that the church is corrupt. Secular authorities have way too much power. They're influencing the selection of bishops. They are preventing the flow of tithes to the central church. They're intervening in the church hierarchy. The secular authorities are trying to prohibit church officials from like being feudal lords. So the church wants to be able to have bishops also be like the government itself, whereas the secular authorities are like, no, you should stay in your place and not be the government. And the church says, okay, we got to deal with this. They also decide that there are some other liturgical reforms that need to happen. Some of these things that were pre-existing, but not uniform. And so the reformist movement, which is really jump-started by a group of monastic orders, makes some important changes. They really crack down on secular authority and assert that church authority is superior. Church officials can hold secular authority. But they also crack down on blatant corruption, the selling of church offices, so to speak.
There's a chapter on this in Tom Holland's book, Dominion, which is sort of a popular press version of church history. He writes a chapter on that.
So they also do some other things. They formally institute communion in one kind. That is that you don't take bread and wine. You only take one. And I always forget which one it is. I think common people would only take bread.
I think it's the bread, yeah.
Yeah, they only take bread.
It's still the case today, basically.
Right. So communion in one kind, that's the first big reform. Or maybe not the first, but this is one of the big liturgical reforms. Another one is celibate clergy. Now, celibate clergy had been common throughout Christianity from the earliest days. This was a common thing. So it's not like saying celibate clergy was like, what? No one ever thought of that before. Like this was a thing that was widespread, but it was not uniform, right? There were many places where non-celibate clergy existed and were uncontroversial. Now, usually as you went up the church hierarchy, celibacy was more and more expected. But especially like your parish priest was often not celibate, and not expected to be,
and not sober either, probably.
Well, yeah. But the reformists strongly believed that clergy should be celibate, and so they instituted it as essentially a mandatory and uniform norm. There had also over time been some disagreement about the wording of the Nicene Creed. Specifically, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father, or does it proceed from the Father and from the Son? Versions of both of these, most Latin versions included from the Son, and most Greek versions did not. Now, there were some Greek versions that did and some Latin versions that didn't, but generally. So there was some disagreement about this theological statement. There was disagreement about how to take communion. There was disagreement about celibacy of clergy, and there was also disagreement about the authority of the Pope. So one disagreement was between the Pope and medieval rulers. That is, the church is superior to secular rule. And on this, the Eastern and Western churches were basically not in agreement, but not in great disharmony. It's just that in the Eastern Church, the emperor was also basically the real head of church. But there was disagreement about who's the head of the church. The Eastern Church believed that each church region, so to speak, had its own legitimate head, and they were peers, right? Rome might be a kind of first among equals, but they were peers. Whereas the Western Church believed that the Pope was the head of the church. So these are the big distinctions. And they come to a head in the 11th century, and the Reformist movement says the church is superior to secular authority. The Pope is the head of the church and superior to all other authorities. Communion in one kind. Religious leaders can hold secular office. And from the Son is, you have to have that to be a Christian. They assert all these things. Immediately what happens is the Protestant Reformation begins immediately. And it begins with a group called the Waldensians in Italy. They immediately flag all these things that these are all problems. These are not okay. This is not what they'd historically been practicing. This is not what they had been taught. They did not believe that this was the teaching of the apostles. They also felt that the Bible should be in Italian. And so they have this uprising, and it basically gets crushed. Small Waldensian communities survive to the present day. Today, they fused with the Methodist Church, I believe. But basically, they have these complaints. Shortly thereafter, the selling of indulgences really kicks off. That instead of selling church offices to raise money, the church sells forgiveness. It's not corrupt. So this starts to kick off. Soon afterwards, a movement called Lollardy begins, or the Lollard movement in England. They have the same criticism: communion in two kinds, corruption into the superiority of the Pope, secular authority, these things. The only thing that all these people are united on is they all use the "and from the Son" phrase in the creed. That's the only one where it's like maybe the Reforms got it right. Maybe that was okay. And the selling of church offices. No one wanted to go back to selling church offices. So the Lollards go and they try to do their thing. They basically get crushed, although little bits of them kind of persist with like the Wycliffite movement in some parts of England. And then you get a group in Hungary about 100 years later, in I think it's the 1300s, called the Hussites, led by Jan Hus. And they have the same critiques. They have an uprising, but they win. Mm-hmm. Like their uprising lasts for like decades and decades, and they like fight off repeated papal armies and all
they
this
sent
stuff.
Crusades after them to try to crush them.
Yeah. And they like keep winning. Now I think eventually they like have like a brokered peace where they like kind of reaccept papal authority, but like they don't really renege on like a lot of their beliefs. But this all gets like, the problem all these people have is that their movements are local and they can't really spread, because the Catholic Church is really the vehicle for spreading news. Mm-hmm. And so anytime this happens, the priests are like, don't tell your locals what's happening. Because your locals are kind of irritated about this nonsense too. Don't tell them that like the Italians are up in arms, or the British are revolting, or the Hungarian, or the Czechs, the Bohemians are revolting. Like, don't tell them. Keep it under wraps. So in the 1400s, this movement comes to Germany. The Germans start to go, what? Led by Martin Luther. But really, we shouldn't inflate the role of Martin Luther. He's like the seventh major figure to try to lead a rebellion on exactly these issues, right? That basically the Gregorian reforms set off what has now become a millennia of chaos in Christianity. The Eastern Church formally split over this issue, right? So instead of having like kind of split, but still technically we're all brothers, the Eastern and Western Church anathematized each other and split off. So you get Catholics and Orthodox. We talk about the Protestants breaking away. That's just as big or bigger of an issue. But it takes time for within the Western Church for the Gregorian reforms to really bear their poisoned fruit. And over time they do. Finally, in Germany, Luther does his thing, but this time it sticks for a couple of reasons. One, the printing press, so his ideas can spread. Two, secular authorities have really had it up to here by this time. So the secular authorities, they don't care about communion in two kinds. Well, maybe some of them do, but like on net, like this is not the motivating issue for the King of Sweden. What's motivating them is that like they would like to have all the money that goes to their local churches not go back to Rome. They'd like to have nice churches in their area, because churches also often double as like government facilities. They'd also like to they'd like to not worry that the Pope is going to like back a pretender to their throne or something, right? And this is particularly acute in the German Empire, in the Holy Roman Empire, where the Pope is highly interventionist, not so far away. And so a lot of the German princes form these leagues, they break away, and this gives Protestantism staying power. There's actually a moment in a famous debate between Luther and this Catholic critic, I forget which debate it is, but it's one of them, where somebody says, you're just advocating the heresy of Hussitism. And Luther is gobsmacked because he's never heard of this heresy. He's like, and it only happened 100 years ago in the neighboring country, but he's never heard of it. So like the next night he like goes to the library and like looks up this term and like finds it. And the next day he comes back and he's like, yeah, I'm a Hussite. They were so right.
Well, there were still Hussites at that time, right? Too.
Yeah,
they had some of them that survived. Yeah.
Yeah. So like so what is Lutheranism? Lutheranism is the first widespread and successful Western counter reaction to the Gregorian reforms. And I know that that's not like the conventional way we talk about the Protestant Reformation, but I think it's important to understand that like the great schism between the East and the West, the rise of Waldensianism and Lollardism and Hussitism and Lutheranism and Calvinism, these are all just different reactions to the festering wound of the Gregorian reforms. And I should mention that Gregory and Urban, if you think, why are those the two pope names I know? It's because it's the first crusade as well. So like go kill infidels for forgiveness is like also one of the products of these reforms. And also you got to keep in mind, like when I say like one of the big issues that the popes were fighting for was that they should be able to also be the secular ruler. Like most of us today are like, even most Catholics are like, no. Right. That like the Gregorian reforms have aged very badly. Little bits of them still survive, like celibate priesthood. The filioque clause, of course, survives. That's not contentious in the West.
That's the and the Son.
Yeah. Sorry, that's and the Son. But like that's basically what Lutheranism is. It's just the last and most successful reaction to the Gregorian reforms.
It's interesting you put it that way, because I really think that's, when I read Charles Taylor's Secular Age, one of the things that I thought he did, I thought it was the most effective anti-Protestant book I'd ever read, even though that wasn't his thing. And one of the reasons was the way that he, accurately sort of positions the Reformation less as this apocal event stemming from Luther nailing his theses to the wall, this break, but as simply an outgrowth of pre-existing currents of reform. He would not have said that it was counter-reform of the kind of Gregorian era reforms, but but there was reform was in the air, and even those reforms were sort of reforms. Yeah, and it involved other things as well, like raising the religious practice of the peasantry, which had sort of been. Yep. They had their carnivals, and they were
the Gregorian. So the Gregorian reforms also accelerated what was an ongoing trend in Europe of professionalizing religion. So this was already happening, but you see in churches built in the 11th century and later, you see more and more intense what were called rood screens, basically walls built between the congregation and the altar, the chancel. So like they could like barely even see what the priests were doing. And those did exist before, but you see them getting like more and more intense, that there's more and more just like, why do we need the peasants to care about this at all? And so one of the big things that the reformers are doing is just like evangelism. Like these people aren't even Christians. They don't believe anything. they cross themselves not because of Christ, but because they think like this is like, keeping out, not as a remembrance of their baptism, but it's keeping off like bad luck because they saw a cat or something. Like,
Right.
it's
Warding
just
off evil
paganism.
spirits.
Yeah. So, and then,
Well, I think some of the mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and them, sort of wanted to go out and,
Yes.
and minister among the people. Let's get out of the monastery. Let's get out among the people.
Yeah. So you get, starting in the 11th century, you do get, there's counteracting things. On the one hand, the Gregorian reforms centrally, they're wanting to centralize power, impose these specific reforms, uniform, like they want to make the church uniform, right? Make it all the same everywhere. And there was reaction to this because it turns out people didn't want the same things everywhere. And maybe you didn't need to have all the same things everywhere. You need to have some things the same, but maybe not everything. You also get really a flowering of liturgical music during this time, I should say. And one reason is because you had a lot of ad hoc local liturgical music in places that sometimes was never even written down or not fully professionalized. But after the Gregorian reforms, there's an urge that we really need uniform church music, right? So you have to produce the uniform church music. All that to say, this to me, it helps illuminate what Lutheranism is, and it also helps illuminate, to me, the beauty and the failure of Lutheranism. And the beauty is that our history, our legacy, our theology really is part of a centuries-old tradition of trying to speak to the whole global church and say, let's be faithful to the things that have always been confessed everywhere by all, so to speak. Like to maintain Catholic orthodoxy. That our argument has never been that like the Pope must be overthrown and like you need to just not have any church hierarchy and whatever. Like, no, it's not our argument. Our argument has never been that like the church wandered in darkness from the apostolic age until our prophet arose, or like, that's not our argument. We're just saying that like the high medieval church instituted some specific reforms that were not good. And that there were a lot of areas where there was diversity within the church that was totally fine to allow it to continue. And that we should have allowed it to continue, and we should stop trying to stop that diversity from occurring. Now, there's also places where we have to be uniform. So actually, the Nicene Creed is a place where there is a real debate there, and so it's debatable how long you could have gone with the East and West together on that. But so this is, I would say, the real beauty of Lutheranism. The real failure of Lutheranism is how obviously this is not what happened historically. That is, it started this way, and then, well, I would argue, and then the Calvinists ruined it for everyone.
Oh, boy.
Instead of just getting on board and saying, okay, let's undo the Gregorian reforms, the radical reformation of the Anabaptists, and then there's debate on how you should treat the Calvinists. But for high church Lutherans like me, they're just frothing radicals. That suddenly their critique is much more expansive than the Lutheran critique, right? The Lutheran critique is, there are some things that have begun fairly recently that are bad that we need to fix. The critique of the Reformed churches, and especially of the Anabaptist churches, is that no, like before 1100, there's a much deeper rot. There's a like fundamentally false teaching that's been going on since, like the 300s or something. And yeah, there might be good church fathers in there that you can work from. Obviously, the Reformed are not, going to anathematize all the fathers. But that like, no, we don't want to maintain anything like the ecclesiastical structure. We don't want to maintain any of these things. And that opens the door for Protestantism writ large. And this is, sometimes Lutherans don't like to identify as Protestants, which is funny since like we are the Protestants. But it's because there's this critique that is now common to most Protestants and even some Lutherans today, which is basically that like the church immediately lost its way after like the disciples or sometimes after Jesus. And we're trying to get back to the early church and be that Acts 2 church. And this is restorationism is what this is. And this is not like the core Lutheran argument. Yes, we think we are contiguous with the Acts 2 church, but we don't think that like everything that happened in between was a mistake. Like maintaining Christian civilization and having creeds and councils was not a mistake. That was good. And like that broad manner of doing things is okay. Now we don't preserve the episcopacy for a variety of reasons, but our critique is much more constrained than much of the broader Protestant critique.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that because there's a few things. If I were to tell you the things that I know about Martin Luther, here's one thing. One is that he went to confession all the time because he had tremendous anxieties about sin, and he had this kind of epiphany about the grace of Christ, and that this idea of a pure gospel, that he wasn't dependent on essentially this system of constant repentance and sacraments and all that. So that's we think about the, grace, kind of salvation by grace, faith, as being very associated with Protestantism, and Luther particularly, kind of his story, and then also how he ultimately rejected monasticism and completely. And married one of the nuns he set free from the convent and all of that. And these things don't factor into your story. So I'm curious how you cite those things in this narrative.
So I've basically told like a social history of Lutheranism, of Lutheranism here, right? But there is a theological element. I think there were the Gregorian reforms. They were a mistake. They did all these bad things. People reacted. Okay, so where does the classical Lutheran story of like the five solas come in? Sola scriptura, the Bible alone, and all these things. So Luther posts his theses, and he thinks these are going to open the debate. Instead, he basically gets kicked out of the church. So then he realizes that the rot is much deeper than he knew. And so he starts this movement. He's still hoping for some kind of reunification by the time of his death, but he's kind of hoping against evidence. So where do these things fit in? Do I think that we're all in theological agreement and it's really just these Gregorian reforms? No. There are distinctive theological, and I would also say like socio-emotional differences between these religious groups. But the reason I do is because actually Catholics and Lutherans have reached language on mechanism of salvation that like we all agree on. We can all agree to those words, more or less. Now, my denomination has not signed this joint statement, but it's not necessarily because we think those words are wrong. It's because, and this is funny, it's because we think that the Catholics mean different things by those words than we mean by them, right? So at this point in Christianity today, the main debate is not on, are there words and sort of broad social behaviors we can all agree are true? It's, you don't mean the same thing by those words, right? Over the last 500 years, Catholicism today is not the religion of 1400. There's nothing like that religion. I mean, many of the things we think of as
Don't tell
like
Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeulen that.
I mean, things like the Immaculate Conception or papal infallibility, like they come from relatively recent dogma. I mean, this is not
20th
ancient.
Century even. I think some of them are even late 19th
so
century for sure.
This is, these arise. The Council of Trent creates this new religion, which we could call it Trentism. And this is the rejection of Lutheranism, basically, by the Catholic Church. So Trentism really is the modern Catholic religion up until Vatican II. Then arguably Vatican II creates a whole new religion. So now within the Catholic Church, you kind of have two dueling religions, right? you have Trintism and Vatican IIism, right? And so that's what you see.
You're going to cause me a lot of grief with my listeners, man. All the Reformed people are going to come after me.
Oh, I know.
And all the Catholics are going to come after me now.
Also,
buddy.
many Lutherans don't like my story here either, because it does downplay what we think of as our distinctives. Now, why are they our distinctives? In the moment that Martin Luther promulgated these ideas, he didn't think they were distinctive, right? The 95 Theses, he didn't think he was overthrowing the Catholic Church. He thought he was probably nudging people, but he was like, these are probably things a lot of people are just going to agree with. They'll disagree with some, but these are going to get widespread acceptance. And here's the thing, they did. Even a lot of the Catholic princes thought a lot of these individual ideas are okay. And so the Jesuits, who are there to like crush Lutheranism, decades or centuries later, end up kind of like soft adopting some of this stuff. And this is why like our first Jesuit Pope is also like super like Lutheran friendly. Like he really likes Lutheran stuff. And he's always talking about like how great Luther is and stuff. Because the Jesuits were like, actually a lot of Lutheran ideas are like wildly popular within Catholicism. And Luther was right that a lot of these ideas were actually not so radical to rank and file Christians in Western Europe of his day. The problem is that over time they have become distinctive, because what has happened is that the Church of Trent has dug into the difference. And then also Lutherans, Protestants have, obviously.
Well, once you split off, you become, the cultural, just culturally, you go on completely different trajectories. It's like America and England. We kind of have two parallel trajectories now. We're not the same people.
Yeah. And especially when there are two groups that are fighting wars with each other, you define yourself against each other. And so the solas, you see them early on in Lutheranism, but they really grow in importance over time. That they become more and more like, oh, we really are different on this. And so you can see in the Lutheran confessions, they become more and more strident over the course of like a century of writing. At first, they're like, look, we can work this out. You're mischaracterizing us. Probably there's some similarity here. And by the end, they're just like, you people are nuts. You're all going to hell. This is the truth. We are not budging. Which of course, that's what happens when a Twitter thread runs for 9,000 tweets, right? So, and that's what Reformation is a really long and angry Twitter thread, basically. It's not that those things are distinctive to Lutherans today, and they became distinctive for Lutherans fairly early on. But it's important to recognize when early Lutherans were advancing these things, they thought that these were going to be really popular ideas that a lot of people were going to accept, and they weren't wrong. These were not distinctives at first. So the motivation, yes, it was salvation by grace and all these things, but Luther thought he was going to say this and everyone was going to go, you're right. That is what we should believe. That is our true faith that's been concealed by these screwed up things. And there's these institutional markers of that we need to deal with. That's not what happened exactly. So we should not be characterizing the Lutheran movement as like Martin Luther asserted grace because none of the Catholics believed in grace. Rather, we should say is that Martin Luther and other Lutherans thought they were going to say this, and everyone was going to go, yeah, you're right. Let's do that.
Well, again, there were all these currents. I think this is an important point that everyone should get, is like Martin Luther. The Reformation didn't spring fully formed from the brow of Martin Luther.
Yeah.
That there were all these currents in the air that had been going on for a long time, and some kind of lightning caught lightning in a bottle, and something happened with Luther and some of these other people, and so we're coming out. So we're going through this process of the Reformation, and I would say there were basically three main groups that came out of that. When you have the Catholic Church, which goes through its own process of reform again through Trent. You have the Lutherans, and then you have basically the Anabaptists, who we don't need to go to them necessarily right now, but it seems like nobody liked the Anabaptists at all. And then basically everybody else kind of you can think of as loosely are the Reformed. So the main divisions within the Reformation were between the Lutheran and the Reformed, uh, which people often think of the Reformed as Calvinism. Although I would say I'm less familiar with Lutheranism. I do think a lot of Lutheranism does seem to be built around Luther. It's his translation of the Bible. It's his catechisms.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are there that he personally wrote that are still there, and it's called Lutheranism. And the Reformed tradition was built off of a broader set of thinkers, I would say. Certainly not just Calvin, for sure. But you could think of essentially the rest of it as that. And then the Anabaptists had a completely different, they really had a more radical vision. They rejected essentially, I think the critique was that they sort of rejected the citizenship of the believer in the earthly kingdom. And so they were basically viewed as a threat to civil society everywhere. It was the one thing the Catholics, the Reformed, and the Lutherans all agree on. You got to get rid of these Anabaptists.
Yeah.
So they sort of were their own thing, and they're still there. But how did the Lutheran and the Reformed interact and form into two distinct groupings?
So so first, it's worth mentioning the diversity in traditions. Lutheranism really begins, and it remains, partly because of the distinct personality of Martin Luther, quite frankly. Martin Luther was a reformer. He was also very clearly a German nationalist. And nationalism was not really a thing at his day. Like you read any other writer from Luther's day, and it's almost uncanny how little nationality plays into them. And then you read Luther, and he's modern. You read him, and you're like, this is just like modern nationalism. I recognize this. Like this feels so familiar. And so this puts Lutheranism on a really distinct trajectory. It's going to be a German thing. And then it gets into like some Germanic cultural offshoots in like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, this stuff. But it's like basically a German project. And so when the Anglican Church invites Luther to come and lead them, or when the British basically invite Luther to like come to England and like do some stuff, he's like, nah, I'm good in Germany. So the Anglican Church is sort of proto-Lutheran at first. But then the Anglican Church is like the football being kicked between Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed, right? Like the Anabaptists never get a shot at it, but we're all fighting for the Anglicans, right? And the Lutherans have an early lead, and then the Reformed and the Catholics end up kind of splitting it between themselves. So Lutheranism goes on this very distinct kind of national trajectory. The Reformed Church is in Switzerland. They're working in German. They're working in French. They are working in Italian. Very quickly,
don't forget Latin. They're still writing in Latin.
Right, Latin. Yeah. Very quickly, they have arrived in Scotland, and they're speaking. I'm not going to say English because that accent is, but the language of the people of Scotland.
Maybe speaking Scots. I think a lot of them spoke Scots.
Yeah. Like the Reformed tradition, Dutch, right? Like the Reformed tradition, like immediately from its like first origins is this like polyglot thing that very quickly gets very complicated and immediately develops all these sub movements, right? The Dutch Reformed are on their own path, and the Swiss are one place, and the Huguenots in France are a totally different thing, and the Presbyterians up in Scotland are their own beast. And today we talk about the Reformed tradition. There are a lot of commonalities, but there's a lot of difference within the Reformed tradition. In the Lutheran tradition, until about 1960, there's no difference. Like there's just not. Like I should say until like 1800 probably. Basically until modernity, Lutheranism is Lutheranism is Lutheranism. The Reformed Church pretty immediately is splitting and doing their own thing. By language, by region, by all these things. Lutherans might have all kinds of schisms. We have tons of institutional schisms. But at the end of the day, like until until like basically the Prussian Union, which is I think like the 1820s. Yeah, like there's some disputes over like pietism here or there, but like there just aren't the big like everyone going their separate ways and having their own theological movements that you see in the Reformed tradition. And that's partly because Lutheranism is a state church, right? So Lutheranism pretty immediately is like a state church. Now, Calvinist, there are Calvinist state churches in Germany as well. And you get that too, but you get a lot more diversity in the Reformed movement.
Right. What you bring up, I think, is really important in the sense that if you look at Europe, there really is a regional cultural flair to religion. Southern Europe remained Catholic. France, Spain, Italy, the Germanic world tended to become Lutheran. Germany, Scandinavia became Lutheran, and then sort of
the Baltics,
Northwest Europe, and a lot of that became Reformed. And people have made various points that these religions sort of suited the culture and personalities of those
it's a little more complicated than that. You have to remember that France was well on the way to becoming Protestant. They basically had a Protestant king at one point, but it was crushed.
Right.
Calvinism appealed very much to a very large segment of French society, and it was exterminated with extraordinary violence.
Right. Well, Calvin was basically French himself.
Yeah. Calvinism spread in Italy as well, was also crushed. It reached a lot of Eastern Europe in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and did fairly well.
Killing it there.
The problem that Calvinism had is that they were really good at converting 10% of the population of anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They were not good at converting 60% of the population of anywhere. Mm-hmm. There's always 10% of people who will believe the insane things that Calvinists believe about God's personality.
Well,
it's a joke. It's a joke.
But here's the point. Here's the point about Lutheranism, though.
Yeah.
Lutheranism seems to have become very ethnically bound.
Yes.
In a way that other ones did not.
Yeah.
And we even see that since we were technically supposed to be talking about America. We haven't got to America. We even see that in America.
Yes.
Lutheranism in America is ethnically bound.
So this is part of the key to Lutheranism's success, right? Is that it became fused with German liberation, all these things. It became a state church closely tied to ethnicity, which meant Lutheran getting exterminated in France, exterminated in Romania, like getting The Lutherans were like, shields up, solidarity, don't break ranks, we're not giving in. So like Lutherans have this like phalanx mentality. Like there is intense
I'd never guessed that
solidarity.
from listening to you talk about Lutheranism.
And I have some research on this that's not published yet, but it hopefully will be this year. Like exploring like these mentalities of solidarity and stuff among Lutherans. And it really is like intense. And so like, yeah, it is an ethnic thing, but it's a key to their success in Europe. The only reason we talk about Calvinism at all, outside of like the Dutch are weird, is because of America. Because the Calvinists lost the battle for Europe.
But we won the battle for America.
Yeah, they kind of hung on in Scotland. They kept a faction in the Church of England. They did well with the Dutch. Like there were bits, there were corners of Northwest Europe where they hung on, but they got to America and bred like hamsters. Right? So like this is why anyone cares about the Reformed tradition, is because European diseases were very effective at depopulating North America and making it ripe for settlement. And it so happened that one of the countries that had a reformed, so the Dutch tried to settle North America, and they kind of had some success in North America, in New York, but not much. French Calvinists moved to North America, cannibalized each other, and then
Right,
the
that's
survivors.
the Huguenots, or
Yeah,
use
yeah.
the American pronunciation here.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
the first round of them cannibalized each other, and then the second round were genocided by the Spanish. Um, the Swedish Lutherans tried to settle in North America,
yeah,
and
the Delaware Valley, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't really stick. Um, uh, it finally doesn't stick until the British, and it's not even necessarily because of like something unique to like Reformed culture. I mean, Jamestown sticks as well. It's basically like the British find a way to make it work, right? Um, and there's interesting quirks about that, but it has nothing to do with like the distinctives of the Reformed religion. When French Catholics moved into Quebec, they also bred like hamsters, and that's why everyone speaks French around me today.
Yeah.
Right? If the French had settled everywhere, it'd be like that. That we'd all be Catholic, right? Um, so it was basically luck of having a considerable English speaking Reformed population in the country that happened to find a way to make settlement of North America stick.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Now, I
that's
will
why the
say,
Reformed tradition exists, basically.
now, did the Lutherans, now what you describe of the state church and remaining very stable throughout time, suggests to me it was sort of a dead tradition in a lot of ways. That
So this
it was
is the
stagnant. It
curse of
wasn't very,
Lutheranism.
it wasn't very dynamic. We're sort of like we're Norwegians, we're
Yes.
Lutheran, and
Yes.
we don't change because people aren't dynamically
Yeah.
engaged. There's not a lot of
So
dynamism.
the first so from the 1500s, when the Reformation begins and Lutheranism is launched, until the early 1700s, you have a lot of dynamism in the Lutheran churches. And I say that Lutherans really hate to talk about innovation as a good thing because it's terrible. No one should innovate. The Gregorian reforms were an innovation and they ruined the church. Return. That's like the Lutheran ethos. But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, there was a lot of innovation, and you see this in musical forms. You see this in church architecture and art. You see this in Lutheran publication and Lutheran theology of this. We call it the golden age of Lutheranism. Um, it produces these incredible works that are still the mainstays of Lutheran theology today. And they were innovative. And what I mean by innovative is they were tackling problems that had not been tackled before. And they were not just proof texting it with the prior guy. They were
Hmm.
saying, okay, he said this, but like that's not a satisfying answer for this problem. Let's delve deeper. Let's dig deeper. Let's see what does our tradition, what should it really say here? So there is a lot of innovation. It dies. Um, uh, why did it die? You can tell a lot of these like specific stories, but basically, a movement arises called pietism that is symptomatic of a wider movement, which is that with modernity, people are moving towards a different kind of emotional life. Um, they want a religious experience that is more closely tied to their emotional life. This was not problematic for Lutheranism in the 1500s or 1600s, but by the 1700s, we want a church tied to our emotional life was problematic for the pastors who were basically professional bureaucrats.
Hmm.
So by this time, for Denmark is a great example of this. By this time in Denmark, um, your church was your tax register. It was your register for military service. It was also you had no civil or legal rights outside of your parish. So if you moved to the city, but then you needed to like file a lawsuit, you only actually had legal rights in your home parish. And this was used to keep peasants tied to the land to prevent the problems of urbanization. So basically, a conservative landowning class had come to dominate the states
You
of
needed
the
a
Lutheran
huku
parts
or
of
whatever
Europe.
they would say in China to move to the city
Yeah,
there.
yeah, basically, yes. So conservative landowners had come to dominate the politics of the Lutheran lands.
Mhm.
And in turn, they used the church to keep the peasants tied to those lands. And the result was that when the peasants wanted this more, they wanted more tradesmen, more merchants, which is funny because Lutheranism began as basically like, you can be a tradesman and be a good Christian. You're not inferior to a monk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like this was in many ways a betrayal of what Lutheranism was. But because it was so tied up with the state that it was connected to, that the church could not resist the state. So over the course of the 1700s, at first, you can see this in Lutheran writings of the day. At first, it's kind of like, Lutheran writers don't quite notice what's going on. And then you start to get them being like, oh, the pietists are stealing all our people and the pietists are theologically bad and yada, yada, yada. And they're true. Like the pietist movement did have a lot of theological
Who were the
problems.
pietists? Can you give me like a 2-minute definition of
Um,
pietism?
uh,
Because I don't think I've ever heard a
so
compelling
pietism,
definition.
it's hard to associate with specific denominations, but you can think of it as Methodism.
Mm-hmm.
Low church sacraments, high emphasis on emotional experience, high emphasis on works as definitional to identifying who is really a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Pietism is concerned with who is really a Christian because they say just because you're baptized in the state church doesn't make you a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Lutherans are like, no, you are baptized in the state church. This is who you are. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the conflict between pietism and state Lutheranism really gets rancorous and intense. And so you get a lot of German pietists who are basically saying, I don't think just being baptized as an infant in the state church is enough.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I don't think this church is really teaching the gospel. They just want me to stay they just want me to stay a poor farmer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even see my pastor all that often. Mm-hmm. He's a non-resident pastor, right? So you start to get this stuff. And so poor German peasants start looking for alternatives. They start moving to America. So the early German migrations to America are mostly not Lutherans. They're mostly pietists. And if they are Lutherans, they are dissenting Lutherans. They're Lutherans who are like, we don't want any of that. And so then this comes to a head in like the 1790s, in the early 1800s in Prussia. Prussia forces a union of the Lutheran Church and the Reformed Church because theology doesn't matter. It's just about maintaining control. And this drives the Lutherans bonkers because they're like, heck no, we are not united with those psycho Reformed people. So then there's a series of very large migrations of Lutherans from Germany to North America. And that's the foundation of the LCMS. There's basically, you get a lot of Germans unhappy with the religious community of Germany and also the resulting economic structures, right? Conservative landowners preventing, economic uplift and these things. And so they move to America. Eventually, some of the state churches and some of the non-state churches of Northern Europe start to send pastors to North America to minister to these people. You get different kinds of resolutions there. But this is the genesis of the church in America, is a mixture of some people loyal to the state churches back home, some people nominally loyal but hoping for theologically revival, some people nominally loyal but don't care, some people openly hostile, and this is the migration of Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, all these people. They come here.
There's also a huge Catholic migration too. At that time as well. So there were a lot of Germans coming here for, again, these unhappy with the government. I think my grandfather, who was a German Catholic, came here fleeing conscription in some war. He didn't want to fight it.
Right. So during the German Wars of Unification, this gets even more intense. And so this is the origin of American Lutheranism, is basically all these people leaving state churches. And they wanted something better. They wanted something more vibrant. But the state church instinct doesn't just go away, right? So like a lot of the growth of these churches in America was literally pastors would go and stand on the docks or at the train station and just like start talking in German and see who turns around. Or, it's a boat from Germany. There's Lutherans on it. So let's get them in church. Let's help find them roommates and houses and all these things.
Did the Lutheran Church play a large role in immigrant assimilation, than the way that the Catholic churches did too?
Oh, absolutely. It's huge. And so there's even classic studies on like There's a really there's a really good one with political dissenters in the 1840s fleeing Germany. And these guys are nationalists, but they're also mostly Lutherans. And the towns that they move to as refugees have like more Union Army membership. They're more likely to have German language newspapers. They have more Lutheran churches, all this stuff. But like, yes, you also see this in like Lutheran church archives that like they are doing these things, and they're still speaking in German until basically World War One. And then in the late 19th century, and then with World War One especially, you get the transition to English. Some had transitioned much earlier, but most then. But like my denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, historically was mostly Germans. But we also have, like, actually the church I attend in Montreal, its full name is the Slovak Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Unaltered Augsburg Confession of Ascension. We call it Ascension Lutheran Church. But what they're saying is we are Slovak. So they didn't change to English. They didn't change out of Slovak until I think the 70s or 80s. We're Slovak. Unaltered Augsburg Confession, meaning we are not going along with this Prussian Union nonsense. We are not uniting with Reformed. We are sticking to the true Lutheranism. And so that's what defines the church is Slovak, truly Lutheran, right? And so, but it's part of the LCMS. So the LCMS in America is an amalgamation of a lot of these older national denominations that had conservative dispositions. The ELCA is an amalgamation.
Yeah. Can we put that on pause for just a second? Because I want to get to America. I think this is great.
Yeah.
Because you're covering some of the material, but there's a couple other little things I want to cover off on like the background of Lutheranism before we get there. So I got a couple things. One is, did Lutherans send missionaries to other countries? Were Lutherans really into missions?
Oh, yeah.
So the Reformed would say, Presbyterians would say, we converted South Korea. Like we actually had success in a country. Did the Lutherans, were they really as big into missions as, say, the Baptists are today or something like that? Or is it?
Okay, first of all, we have to deal with this South Korea nonsense.
Okay.
South Korea began to convert with missionaries from various denominations, including Lutherans, to be clear. But Christianity did not take off in South Korea until the Japanese occupation, when Christians of all stripes, Reformed and others, wouldn't pay homage to the Japanese. And so it became a sign of resistance to the Japanese. And so it became a national resistance phenomenon. And so Christians became associated with Korean national resistance to Japan. By this time, the missionaries had all fled. Okay. Like this was not a mission project. This was spontaneous conversion of Koreans in response to local issues that had, yes, the seeds were planted by missionaries of various kinds, mostly Reformed, but not only. But like the story of the Korean church is basically seeds were planted. The Japanese were terrible to all Koreans. The Christians made a compelling witness, and then Koreans converted Koreans, or a lot of Koreans were just like,
to Presbyterianism.
To a variety of movements, including a lot of weird cults.
Yeah, like the Moonies and all that. But I think the key was the Lutherans were big into evangelism. So Lutherans,
yes. So India is a huge example.
Okay.
Tanzania, Madagascar, there are more Lutherans in Africa than there are in Europe. The country that has
There's
the most
more of everybody in Africa than there is in Europe.
Yeah. But the country with the most Lutherans in the world is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a nice example because it's not like Germany owned it, right? Like this is not a colonial church. Like it was just mission work. It was just good old fashioned go in and proclaim the gospel. Tanzania is a huge one, though that was like a German state church thing. Madagascar, though, again, that's a somewhat colonial church. But the biggest Lutheran churches, some of the biggest Lutheran churches are in India, which is not a colonial church at all. That's just missions. And Indonesia, which again is just, it wasn't a colonial thing. It was just missions. We also, the church body I was affiliated with in Hong Kong, the largest Christian church body in China before communism took over was Lutherans, which is why the state church in China still has a lot of Lutheran ancestry.
Hmm.
They still use a lot of Lutheran materials with modifications to fit
with
the Chinese
Chinese
regime.
characteristics, as they might
Yeah,
say.
yeah. Although, again, I should say, to the shame of Lutheranism, sometimes there were more Lutheran materials available friendly to an autocratic state than there should have been.
Right.
So,
well, it's a state church, then it probably lends itself
right.
to.
And of course, you cannot have a history of Lutheranism without mentioning Germany from 1932 to 1945.
Yeah, Luther was very anti-Semitic. It was very
yes, he was. And we know historically it wasn't just Luther. Towns that converted to Protestantism had more pogroms. They were more anti-Semitic. They became more anti-Semitic probably as a result of Lutheranism, frankly. And this is not a good thing. This is terrible. Now, it's not necessarily because Lutheranism had a more distinctively anti-Semitic theology. It's because Lutheranism encouraged popular piety, and all Christian forms at that time were anti-Semitic.
Right.
So if you intensify the level of religion, and it happens to be that religion is anti-Semitic, more Jews get killed. And that's a terrible thing. That's a damnable truth about Christianity in that time period. And praise God, in this modern age, most of us have seen the error of the theological beliefs that were motivating these absurd beliefs. But now I should say there's also legacies of this. A lot of non-denominational Christians will celebrate Seder meals during Passover. This is a little bit corny and cheesy. You're not Jewish. Why do you do this? Like, okay, it's a little corny and cheesy. But you know what? Among non-denominational movements, this, or like among a lot of like generic Protestants, it's like, it's cheesy, but like, whatever. If you want to do that, knock yourself out. Among Lutherans, this is controversial. Like when I shared a photo of like, we did like a Christian Seder, like I got serious pushback. Like, this is like theologically problematic. You're Judaizing. And I'm like, we have extensive documentation of early Christians doing Seder meals apart from Easter. Like we have the liturgies they used at them. Like this was a thing they did. Not all Christians, but some. Like there's no theological problem with this. It's not required, and yes, it's a little cheesy and corny. I grant that. And I should know
talk about when we talk about Reformed theology in a minute. We'll find out about about that. I do want to just, I hate to even bring this up.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk a little bit about the theological distinctives of Lutheranism. And so first, I'll give you my take on what I think, especially versus the Reformed tradition or other people's tradition versus the Lutheranism, what kind of distinguish them. And I think there are a couple big ones that I see. One is the sacramental system of the Lutherans, in which the Lutherans retained much of the Catholic high sacramentality, so that Lutherans believe in baptismal regeneration and also believe in the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in communion, although do not interpret it the way that the Catholics do with their transubstantiation. Whereas in the Reformed tradition, baptism is a sign and a seal of the covenant, but does not regenerative, and the real presence of Christ is spiritual, not physical, in the sacrament. So there seems to be a sacramental difference in sacramental systems. And then my other one I'll say is the mode of worship, and that a lot of Reforms are very into this, especially the surviving forms, the regulative principle of worship, that only those things which are explicitly biblically commanded are valid forms of worship. And so the Reformed tend to reject. They don't do typically don't have like a mass, like a liturgy. They didn't have a lot of art. They were very, they got rid of a ton of stuff. They didn't have instruments. A lot of them didn't do instruments. They had exclusive psalmody. So the Reformed had a much, much more austere and restrictive form of worship than the Lutherans, which basically held to the traditional Latin worship, liturgy.
So I have to quibble with your description of the sacraments, because if I didn't quibble with your description of the sacraments, I would be stripped of my Lutheran card.
Okay.
And I want to emphasize the word physical here. So some Lutheran is, no matter what I say here, some Lutheran is going to tell me that I'm misdescribing the sacraments. And the reason for that is that they are a mystery on some level. And so we are really resistant to describing in too specific of terms exactly.
We don't believe in mysteries. The Reformed Church doesn't believe in
Yeah,
mysteries.
yeah,
That's
so
the other
we
thing.
do.
We got it all figured out.
Yeah,
I think that's one
you all
thing.
have it all. You all have it all figured out, and you know the mind of God. You even know
Right.
in what order God thought of His ideas.
We do. Yes.
So, but Lutherans are a little more mysterious. So, but that means that no matter how I explain this, some Lutheran is going to tell me that I'm a heretic. In fact, mere moments ago, one particularly anti-Semitic current Lutheran quote tweeted me and said, "You have to remember, not only is Lyman not a Lutheran, he's not even a Christian." So just to give you a sense, no matter what I say here, someone is going to say that this is blasphemy. So Catholics believe and some Catholics are going to hate that I say this, in a physical or a quasi-physical transformation of the elements. That is, that the bread and wine are transubstantiated. The substance is trans, it is changed. It is a changed substance. Okay? Now, there's debate on exactly how physical you want to talk about that, but it's a changed substance. So Lutherans believe that Christ is really present in communion. So what does it mean that he's really present? We do not believe that if you apply a microscope that you will observe Christ. So in that sense, his presence is not, quote, physical.
Okay.
Right? There is no physical addition to the observable thing. Like it is not a change of substance. Okay. To the extent that we apply any descriptive language to exactly where Christ is, we would say something like in, with, and under. He is in, with, and under the sacraments. He is in them. He is with them. I like the under one. It's like he's hiding under them. But he's in them. But it's not like if you stole a communion wafer that it's like you can't it's not like if you put it under a microscope, you're like, there's Jesus. And it is different from transubstantiation, and it's different in important ways. Lutherans believe it's very important to be respectful of the sacrament because Christ is really present in it. For Catholics, if you spill that wine, you have to lick it up off the ground, every bit of it. That's whole,
right. That's why, when Notre Dame was on fire, the Catholic priest who's the chaplain has to go in and rescue the consecrated host.
Right, because otherwise, Jesus is destroyed, right? For us, while you should not dispose of it disrespectfully, communion is communion because the words of institution are validly said with a valid body of believers to receive it. There are three communions. There's the communion of Christ with the elements, the communion of Christ through the elements with us, and there's the communion of the believers with each other receiving together. That is, if only one of these is present, it's not communion. So what that is to say is that while we do believe in the real presence, absolutely. I just want to quibble a little bit on physical because it's not a change of substance. Okay.
Well, I think the key is there's a distinct view of the sacraments between the Lutheran and the Reformed. It probably forms the core
this is important. Where this is important is the question of how are you saved? Lutherans would say you are saved because God, in his good freedom, has chosen to save you, and the mechanism by which he has chosen to save you is his grace given to you in, with, and under through the waters of baptism. His grace given to you in the absolution of your sins through the words of a pastor. His grace given to you in the elements of communion. His grace given to you in the written words of Scripture. These are the means of grace. You are not saved because you have a feeling. You are not saved because you have an assurance. You are not saved because your pastor told you you're one of the people that God chose when he elected some people and not others. You are saved because you were baptized. You confessed your sins and received forgiveness from a pastor. You were given communion because these things were given to you. They are external an objective means of salvation, means of grace. This is the distinction theologically between Lutherans and Reformed. We believe that external things hit your body and change you spiritually. Okay? And so those external things matter. They're really important. We are fairly inflexible about abandoning our historic liturgy because this is what Christians for all of time have been doing. Mm-hmm. Why would we say that what they have been doing is wrong? Like these are not just regulations God gave for tips on how to worship. This is literally how you get saved. Mm-hmm. Whereas Reformed would say they would agree, God saves you by his good and free grace, which is given to you. It is not your own work. Up to here, we're like totally in agreement. We're in agreement that like man adds nothing to his own salvation. That, the human will is dead before grace reaches it. You don't choose to be saved. We both love to hate on like Arminianism. Up to here, we're in the same place. But Reformed would say, but the way you become saved is not that baptism now saves you, but that God elects you. And because you are elect, the baptism can create faith. There's varieties here. Some would say, because you are elect, you have faith, and the baptism is a recognition of that. That's kind of like a more radical view. There's the less radical view that God creates faith or God elects you, and so baptism is able to create faith in you because you are elected. So this gets into like what order.
I'm not totally up on Reformed sacramentalism, and I know there was diversity. There was diversity within it, and I would say, practically speaking, today, from a practical standpoint, I think most people, even the Reformed, it would go solve themselves really Reformed. It's basically symbolic. There's very little. I would think that's not the theological position, but that's the practical position.
Yes, practically speaking. Even if theologically there is a much more sophisticated belief, I want to acknowledge that, because otherwise my PCA followers are going to be
Stephen Wedgeworth's already on the hunt, buddy.
Yeah, they'll be like, you don't even understand us.
Oh, right.
There's nothing Presbyterians hate more than being misunderstood. Right. And they'll give me a lot of blog posts to read.
Yeah. Okay.
That will show me that my views have already been destroyed.
Right. Well, again, we've had it all figured out.
Yeah. There is diversity, but broadly speaking, yes. The difference is that Lutherans think that God, in his free grace and his magisterial sovereignty, has actually created means of grace that are given to me, and I add nothing to them. Mm-hmm. It's not like I'm so good that I receive communion. I'm not. It's not like I'm so good that I get baptized. We baptize babies. Right. They did nothing. They are free gifts that you do nothing to add to. But we do think that they are gifts that you actually receive at actual times, places, and through the means and vocations that God has called to provide them. This also leads to a different theology of the clergy, for what it's worth. Whereas Reformed would say God saves you in his sovereign liberty in such and such a way. But God saves you, but also for reasons inscrutable to us, God has established these regulations. Mm-hmm. And so you should do them. And this is my favorite. This is actually my favorite thing, and a genuine admiration I have for Reformed folks, is there's so many places in the Bible where God tells us to do something. And the Reformed answer for why we should do it is because God told us to do it. And the's just no curiosity on why God told us to do it. And I actually admire.
We're going to get in trouble now. We can't. But I just
admire the willingness to suspend curiosity. Because that is what's going on here. Lutherans say that God told us to baptize, and we say he would not have told us to do something that was like just for funsies. Right. But anyway.
Well, the last part of this, I'll just admit, the historic position of the church was like baptismal regeneration. I think is pretty clear.
Yeah.
But now I want to flesh to another theological one, and this is one I don't know the answer to, so you're probably going to pull the wool over my eyes on this one. Is modern theology is typically said to have its origins in Germany. So this idea of historical critical methods of interpreting the text of the Bible, moving away from Mosaic, all the stuff that we associate with sort of liberal theology, it came out of Germany. So was that Lutherans? Looks like Schleiermacher or whatever his name was. What denomination was he in?
Yeah. So I would contest the idea that this all came from Germany. Um, the I mean,
we think
Voltaire,
we talk a lot about German theology
yeah.
in the
So
Reform world, but we don't think of it. And it's weird. Like in the United States, it was practiced in the late 19th and 20th century. You could not become an ordained Presbyterian minister without spending time studying in Germany.
yeah. So Germany is a big part. It's worth noting though, a lot of that Reformed theology of German, a lot of that bad theology of German is actually not coming from Lutherans in Germany. Okay.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Where's it coming from?
A lot of it is coming from Reformed churches in Germany. But actually, by the late 19th century, this is a distinction without a difference because most of Germany has had forced union.
Mm-hmm.
So what's actually going on here in a lot of the German churches in the 19th century, and actually this is in the 18th century too, is that the state churches are so diluting them that they hardly believe anything. And then they force them to merge. And so they have to abandon any belief that's different between the two groups.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so they end up with like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you eventually get positive Christianity, which is taken up literally in that term by the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So what you actually have to do is you have to trace the thread from basically state churches, which Lutherans were a lot of those, but there were a lot of Reformed state churches too. It's just that the Reformed church had been so polyglot from the beginning that it also escaped the state church route.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So this was at a time, for people who don't know, there was no Germany. I mean, Germany was a cultural region, but it was super hyper fragmented into many different little statelets and bishoprics.
Right, exactly. So you've got these Reformed state churches and Lutheran state churches in Germany, and they're just being hollowed out by the experience of being state churches. And by the end of that period, there are efforts to reform them and revive and have revivals. Those efforts fail. One of the most powerful efforts. So the Pietist movement is part of that. But one of the most interesting and compelling examples of an attempt to revitalize one of these state churches, there are two simultaneous attempts in Denmark to revive the Danish Lutheran Church. One is by I'm blanking on his name. This is going to kill me. He has a bunch of hymns that are still in our hymnal. He's a Danish church leader. His theory is basically the church has become too dour and depressing. We need to make some emotional compromises with the Pietist mood. We don't need to change our theology, but let's accommodate some of this cheery happiness in our church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one angle.
Lutheran churches are a little dour, I've noticed.
Yeah, they are. His view kind of gets accepted. He gets kind of taken up on it. He also says we should stop having mandatory baptism of children born in Denmark, which you should stop that. Some other basic reforms to the oppressive state arrangements. But there's another guy who I think is the most intellectually important Lutheran reformer post Melanchthon. So post life of Luther. And is my homeboy, my true entree into Lutheranism, Soren Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. He is misread as an early existentialist. It is a catastrophic misreading. He is trained as a Lutheran pastor, but he refuses to accept ordination because the state church is so corrupt, is so far from the gospel, and he spends his whole life engaging in like ecclesiastical trench warfare with the Danish state church, attacking mandatory baptism, attacking shallow biblical interpretation, attacking modernizing interpretations. His whole life's work is trying to articulate a cogently Lutheran response to modernity that is not just surrender to pietism. Mm-hmm. And in my view, he's successful intellectually. He's catastrophically unsuccessful politically, mm-hmm. and also he was a super weirdo personally. So he didn't win.
Well, his books are also, if you read his material, it's not it's not written in like a very straightforward manner designed to impart.
Yeah.
Like, let me
It's
tell you exactly what I'm thinking here. You
no,
almost
it can be tricky. The other thing is actually in some of them they are very straightforward, but they're straightforward assuming you already know like what he's responding to. Like if you're steeped in Lutheran church writing and also kind of the debates about modernization in the Lutheran churches of his day, a lot of his things he say are like crystal clear, like he's making a very straightforward rebuttal to a common argument. But like none of us are doing that anymore. And like not a lot of people reading Kierkegaard read like Danish church arguments. So that's important. Why did I get on that?
We're talking about modern theology. We're talking about modern theology.
So modern theology, a lot of it does arise in Germany. There's also a lot of French influence in there that gets underbilled because it's not theology, it's philosophy.
Well, in fairness, Germany was sort of like a lot of a tremendous intellectual center. At the time in general, and especially Americans weren't known as a great intellectual people.
And then the Anglican Church, the reason you don't get as much coming out of there is that immediately post-revolution, the Anglican Church is theologically discredited in America. It was a state church in much of America. It was unpopular. It was associated with royalism, all this stuff. And so you kind of get a hiatus on respect for British theologians. And then the British church really goes in, they kind of go through this like high churchy period that just like wasn't appealing to the American mood for a while. So you really get like a century where for a variety of reasons, like British thinkers were just like not interesting to Americans.
But wasn't it until the late 19th century that the American upper class converged on Episcopalianism? I mean, they had been, Unitarians or Quakers, or they'd been other things, and in the post-war era, Episcopalianism became the religion of the upper class, whereas before that it had been much more diverse. I think it's now before we get back to America, my last kind of question. This is relevant to America, I think, as well. My observation is that Lutherans are very, for lack of a better term, sectarian. They don't like to. They're very standoffish. They don't work and play well with others. There's a meme out there. I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. It's like two people from Star Trek. One of them's labeled Lutheran, one Reformed, and somebody asks, "Are you guys friends?" And the Reformed guy goes, "Yes," and the Lutheran guy goes, "No." And you sort of see that, and Lutherans practice certainly the Lutheran Church Missouri said a lot of the Lutherans practice closed communion. So you're only allowed to partake if you're in an approved Lutheran denomination. A Lutheran pastor was disciplined or attempted to be disciplined because he prayed an interfaith prayer service or 9/11. In the Wisconsin Synod, which is another Lutheran one, apparently they won't even say grace before meals together with you. So I gather, I've been told by Lutherans, Scott Yenner, if you know him, he's also a Lutheran, that it is in the confessions that it requires, there's something in the confessions about a requirement for agreement on doctrine for certain forms of Christian fellowship. But I'm curious to know, what kind of accounts for this more sectarian nature, because I think the Reformed, although it's has all of its own particularities and peculiarities, seems to be better able to partner with other groups.
I mean, I'd start by saying when you're right, you don't need to partner with other people. You just need to wait for them to be convinced. So part of it's the ethnic thing, right? There's just a reflex of internal solidarity. But also you have to keep in mind that the Lutheranism arises as a confession. It arises, and what I mean by that is you do have Reformed confessions, but from the beginning, as I said, the Reformed tradition is more diverse. It just is very diverse. The Lutheran tradition wasn't. And so the norms that developed were around strict maintenance of doctrine. because you didn't need to. And also there was a sense that that this was important. That if you like let the walls come down, the Holy Roman, what happens to us, or what happened to the Reformed will happen to us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if we don't crack down on these things, we'll be treated like, we'll become a minority, and then we'll all be killed, right? That Lutherans have an acute sense that someone's always about to try and kill them. Um, like of persecution complexes, we're way up there on persecution
Mm-hmm.
complexes.
Mm-hmm.
We're very high on the list. Um, uh, um, which, I mean, in fairness, like in the U.S., like Lutheran churches and were firebombed during World War I and World War II because we're traitors, right? We're Germans. Lutherans during like anti-immigrant movements in the 1900s, Lutherans were attacked for their religion in some cases because it was too close to Catholicism. When Benjamin Franklin wrote his
Oh yeah.
1752 like anti-immigrant screed about how we need to block them out, he was talking about Lutherans. And also pietists, those two, but especially Lutherans. So it's important to understand, like, we have a strong persecution complex. It's partly because we have like living memory, well, barely living anymore, but like the 1940s was not that long ago. Like it just wasn't. I mean, so we have fairly recent memory of being a minority that felt very precarious in its position. Um, and then also, I mean, yeah, we have a theological sense that we have a valuable confession that we think is true. And scripture is super clear that those who eat and drink without discerning the body eat and drink judgment on themselves about communion.
Mm-hmm.
So LCMS, we recognize baptism of other denominations as long as it's Trinitarian, because scripture says it must be Trinitarian to be valid.
Right.
But any Trinitarian baptism is good. We don't rebaptize.
Mm-hmm.
For confession and absolution, we would say that when a pastor of another denomination says your sins are forgiven, when he says, in the name of Jesus, your sins are forgiven indeed. They don't have to be a Lutheran pastor. Mm-hmm. When another Christian reads the Bible, they read it, they receive the benefits of reading the Bible. Mm-hmm. These are all valid, but scripture is super clear about communion. It mm-hmm. says you should not commune with people who have certain
the fornicators and all this.
Yeah. It's like it fences the table. Scripture mm-hmm. itself fences the table.
Well, I agree.
And so do we. Now, as far as pastors, we do have a different theology of the clergy, related to something we call the office of the keys, that places more strict requirements on pastors. And this is, I mean, we're running long on time here, so I can't go into this too much, but there's sometimes debate about ecumenical services and exactly what kind of participation can be allowed. Generally, I don't like ecumenical services. If you want to do like an ecumenical discussion forum, I'm actually going to be speaking at this ecumenical discussion for McGill students. Mm-hmm. But if it's an ecumenical worship service, I don't even see the point in coming, let alone offering a prayer. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about community grief. I mean, I think the question is what do people believe that we're doing at that service? Mm-hmm. We can't all believe that we're all invoking valid deities or mm-hmm. What do you think is happening here? So I think a lot of what the LCMS is doing is that there's a lot of kind of I know this is a family show, but there's a lot of bullshit in modern mm-hmm. society. Mm-hmm. Of just rationally, this set of beliefs cannot operate together. Mm-hmm. we are all saying contradictory things. We cannot all be right. And yet we just kind of go, oh, maybe right. We're all right in our own way. And Lutheranism is just no, you're not.
Right.
No, you're not.
By the way, the Baptists would say the only reason you want to be Reformed is so you can drink beer and cuss. That's the thing.
Look,
It's
I
like,
was raised Methodist, and actually, I'm still a teetotaler, I should say.
yeah.
Drinking is not a requirement of being, well, I mean, I drink at communion, hey, but,
You're way out on the razor's edge there.
yeah, casual drinking is not a requirement of Lutheranism. It is merely a culture of Lutheranism.
Okay, we had a, I know we're running kind of long here, and I hope you have some time because I do want to get to the United States, but I'd like to move us to the United States. And so we've settled, Lutheranism has arrived in the United States with immigrant groups who have all established their own churches, and clergy have been sent from Europe often who are becoming the pastors of these churches. How does Lutheranism organize itself in the United States?
I had a dear work colleague when I worked at USDA who was raised Lutheran, and he would always say, "No, I'm not part of an organized religion. I'm Lutheran." Because so I have this project where I've tried to chart the history of and membership sizes of all denominations through the entire history of the United States.
By the way, I just put up on the screen this chart I found of Lutheran.
And
Lutheran
that's like a simplified version.
Yeah,
of it.
The other one I found, I couldn't find a high res version of that. But it's a little.
This is like a radically simplified version. Each one of those bubbles actually is like 18 different groups. So here's the way this works. Immigrants would move to America, and then they had a choice. They could either, or they would have three options. Option one: form a congregation in formal connection with your home country church, the state church back there. Ask them to send a pastor, the whole 9 yards. Basically a mission congregation of the home church. Option two: form an independent local American denomination. Option three: join a pre-existing local American denomination. How you resolve those options depends on A, how you feel about the denomination back home, how you feel about denominations locally, and how difficult it is for you to get a critical mass big enough to support to support launching a new denomination. So, language is a big one. If you move into an area and even if there's a theologically good Lutheran church that you agree with theologically, but it doesn't speak your language, you're going to launch a new church of your language.
Right.
If you launch a new church of your language, you then have to decide if you like your home church or not. So, and then you have to figure out the Lutherans moving to Michigan at the same time as the Lutherans moving to Missouri don't always know each other. So they both start their own denomination. And over years and decades and all this time, they all make slightly different decisions about how to deal with different cultural issues of the day. Right? And so they develop, it's like path dependency, right? They develop on different paths. And over time, different paths become more or less compatible. So you have something like 100 or 200, you have like 200 Lutheran denominations over the course of American history, I think.
That's a lot.
That's actually, some of those are probably multiple that just kind of reported things together. And they have names like the Norwegian True Lutheran Synod of Iowa. And then there's the Norwegian True Lutheran Synod of Missouri. But they're not the same denomination. So over time, these groups, they form coalitions. And the coalitions have grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk over time. And I'm not going to bore you with how they've grown and shrunk over the whole time. But in the 60s, two big coalitions formed. One was the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which was basically all the denominations that historically had friendlier ties with the state churches in Europe. Now, there's exceptions to that. I want to be clear. There's not uniform, but in extremely broad brush terms, this is a lot of the churches that had friendlier ties with state churches. Then there was the other group.
Were they not also a lot of historically Scandinavian demographics?
Many of them were, because a lot of the Scandinavians had friendlier ties with their home churches, but there were Germans in there too.
Okay.
It was not purely linguistic. So some of the Scandinavians did join the other group as well. Like I think the Icelanders maybe joined LCMS. I don't know. The other group was extremely broadly schismatic mission organizations, domestic U.S. mission denominations, and churches whose origins was in some kind of dissenting movement from state churches in Europe. There were, for a brief window, there were two groups. Basically, these two groups. This immediately broke down. The dissenter group split because my denomination, the LCMS, was at a period where it was looking like they were start to get a little bit more liberal, and the more conservative group of this coalition, which was the Wisconsin Synod, said, you're getting too liberal. We're going to break away before you drag us down with you. Now, as it happened, we never made the liberalizing moves that they were worried we were going to make, and yet we still haven't like re-coalitioned, because when they broke away, they got even more, it's that thing. They broke away, they got even more.
These are the people who won't pray at dinner with you.
Yeah. Nowadays, some of them will. I have dear friends who are Wisconsin Synod. I have absolutely nothing against them. I disagree with their things, but truly nothing but love for the Wells people. And in particular, they have a wonderful little publishing house that produces the best Lutheran children's books, like on the market, hands down, and they're cheap. Whereas my denomination's publishing house is notoriously wildly overpriced. Okay, carrying on. So like nothing but love for Wells. I think they're a little crazy, but like a good crazy. So the other side gradually became more and more liberal. So ordination of women, then more liberal on homosexuality issues, transgender issues now. Of course, by the 1950s, they were also the side that had basically totally made their peace with like modernizing scriptural interpretation. The theological difference between these groups over the 19th century, and it began in the 19th century, was about basically like biblical scholarship and textual criticism and evolution. And so like, and then basically modern theology. The theological roots go back to the 18th century with basically, should we compromise with these state church differences or not? And that's why I draw that distinction, because sometimes people say, it's about women's ordination, or it's about this, or it's about that. But like, you trace these denominations back, and like a lot, it's not a perfect correlation, but a strong correlation here is basically like, were you angry at the state churches, or were you like in partnership with the state churches?
Well, it sort of makes sense that the people who are more friendly to the state church would become more liberal, as essentially the state in America has become more liberal.
Right.
And so they've reflected that.
Right. So that denomination is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, elca. So now for a while there were then three, basically. There was LCMS, Wells, and elca, ELCA. In the 80s, or in the 70s and the 80s, there was an attempt to drag the LCMS left. It failed, basically because LCMS lay people were like, heck no, we're staying to the unaltered Augsburg Confession.
Right.
There was a schism. The more liberal folks thought they were going to get a huge share of the LCMS. Instead, they got like this much of the LCMS. They formed, but they got a ton of like seminary professors and pastors. They formed the intellectual nucleus. Sorry, it wasn't actually ELCA at first. It was a different set of things, but they
merged in with the ELCA later.
It's in the 80s.
Basically, in every schism that I know of, fewer churches leave than they think.
Yeah. So
that's why I would predict far fewer conservative Methodist churches will leave than people are predicting.
Yeah. So they formed the ELCA in the 80s. And so in the 80s and 90s, the ELCA was this like gigantic titan of Lutheranism, because they had merged like all these denominations. It was also like the fastest declining denomination in America for like 30 years running, and continues to be. They, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, they started schisming because as they got more liberal, their more conservative wing got unhappy, and their more conservative wing started breaking off. And now today in Lutheranism, we are once again at a bewilderingly broad mix of Lutheran denominations.
That's interesting. I hadn't aware that elca had fractured.
Yeah, so they've got NALC, LCMC, Lutheran churches, and maybe LCIM.
Well, that's
There's
been
like
happening
4
with
or 5
Presbyterian since the 70s. There's been 3 split-off denominations from Presbyterianism since the 70s.
ELCA is shrinking really, really rapidly, both through aging and the fact that they don't get a lot of converts. They're actually even less racially and ethnically diverse than the LCMS is, because the LCMS included like the historically Black Lutheran College and the Negro Mission denomination in the 1930s, but they joined us. So all these things. So they are collapsing really, really rapidly. They have these breakaway denominations that are difficult to get reliable statistics on, but they are accounting for a huge share. I mean, now within a few years, it's possible that LCMS will be the largest single denomination in Lutheranism. And it's possible that the ELCA breakaways combined could be bigger than ELCA within the near future. So it's really it's a pretty dramatic decline.
Yeah, I find it really interesting. Again, Lutheranism in America is a cipher to a lot of people. So, and the people who are Lutheran, you don't necessarily associate that they're Lutheran. Isn't like Joni Ernst a Lutheran? There's some people who are Lutherans.
Joni Ernst is ELCA, yeah.
Yeah. But there's never been a Lutheran president of the United States, for example. No. It seems that it's been and yet there are so many Lutherans. When the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, your denomination, has one. This is according to this is Wikipedia. I'm giving you here. Okay, this is not Lyman's latest census that you personally conducted. 1.5 million confirmed members. The mainline.
So that's going to be like people 13 and older.
Right. The mainline Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, has 1.3 million members.
Yeah, we're bigger than them.
Wells, so the conservative Lutheran denomination, one of them, is bigger than the mainline Presbyterian denomination. And Wells, this Wisconsin synod, has about as many members as the Presbyterian Church in America, which is by far the largest conservative Presbyterian denomination. They're like 350,000 members or something like that. So when you look at sort of confessional denomination sizes, conservative Lutheranism is completely dominant, but it exists.
There are a lot of small and mid-sized conservative Reformed denominations,
right?
And then of course there's the Southern Baptists,
right. Well, let's just say the Southern Baptists aren't really confessional, though. I think about it in terms of confessional denominational churches. Yeah. Obviously, these sorts of low church traditions are very dominated, but conservative, although I would say conservative Lutheranism would be classified by most evangelical theologians as, orthodox, theologically orthodox, it really exists completely outside the evangelical social milieu. So unlike conservative Presbyterians who tend to be very tightly connected to all of these Southern Baptists and, the religious right and all of that, conservative Lutheranism just kind of goes on like its own ship, kind of sailing on through the night, completely culturally, politically disconnected from all that.
There's a very simple reason for that, actually, and it's Billy Graham. Mm-hmm. All these other denominations you're talking about are basically denominations that one way or another made peace with the evangelical label. Mm-hmm. One way or another, they basically said, we are part of the evangelical movement. Lutherans did not. Mm-hmm. They were like, evangelical means evangelisch, which means Protestant. Right. So we're evangelicals, you're fake. Mm-hmm. So which is like that classic Lutheran.
I think in continental Europe, evangelical does just mean Protestant.
It does,
to this day.
So Lutherans did not, and so to this day, like, it's really funny. Like, religious surveyors will list like, these are evangelical Protestant denominations. And then if you actually go through them and you look at like what share of them agree with the term evangelical, for
Mhm.
most of these, like for PCA or for Southern Baptists, like 70-80% of people will say, I'm
Mhm.
evangelical. For LCMS, it's like 30% will agree that they're evangelical. So it's like, maybe you misclassified that group. Maybe they're like, and what's really going on is pollsters mean conservative, but they don't want to say conservative.
Right.
Um, so
Well, I mean, like
like,
people, and they just don't know anything about it. Like I talk with, I talk with people who are, even who are involved in conservative politics, who are,
yeah,
and they just don't know much about the evangelical Christian world. It's just socially completely different.
yeah. So
How do you feel about
evangelicalism. But this is the issue: is that Lutherans, while they're conservative, they are not part of evangelical world.
right? Well, that's
Lutherans
for
are not
sure.
subscribing to Christianity today.
Yeah.
Lutherans are not. They are not in that orbit, and so it's striking that one of the most strident kind of like clearly conservative Christian, but like not Trumpist voices in American politics. You've got the Mormons, and then who else do you have? You have Ben Sass,
Mm-hmm.
who was born and raised LCMS and was president of a Lutheran college. Now, I don't know. I think his official bio now just says he's evangelical, which is like ironic given what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But like Lutheranism creates a different kind of space that has political consequences as well.
Right. Well, again, that's part of being sectarian is, being part of a
Yeah.
trans-denominational movement like evangelicalism is just not in the cards.
Yep.
And then the other thing that I really notice about a Lutheranism is it has built its own entirely self-contained institutional infrastructure. It's not just that you have your own publishing companies; you have your own denominational schools, which I don't think any denominations other than the Lutherans maintain like a large scale educational
Yeah.
infrastructure. There are a lot of there are Episcopal academies, and I do think that the Dutch Reformed, the Christian Reformed Church, has some very similar type of things where they have a lot of they do have their own kind of denominational colleges and schools, but it just seems like there's like a self-contained
Yeah.
universe. You have your own grade schools, your own high schools, your own colleges, your own seminaries, and
Yes.
how
And
is it
this
that you
is
developed? How is it that Lutheranism here in a detached from a state church environment developed these institutions?
um
Because presumably in Europe, it was
holding
tightly interlinked with
grudges.
it was interlinked with the state.
Grudges.
Mm,
When you just have a big enough chip on your shoulder about the rest of society, as
mm,
Lutherans do, it motivates making your own institutions. Now, I
mm,
should say one of the things going on here is that LCMS has institutions that are denominationally affiliated. A lot of other denominations actually have much bigger institutions. They're just not owned by the denomination.
mm-hmm.
So that's something to keep in mind. Um, and arguably that's a strength. That right now the Lutheran system is struggling. A lot of our colleges are folding. A lot of our schools are struggling to stay open. Now, some of that is not because it's bad to have those things. It's because Lutherans, one place where they did not maintain their difference was in their families. Lutherans adopted lower fertility rates sooner than most other Christians did. They adopted birth control much faster, smaller family sizes much faster. Lutherans adopted these norms pretty quickly, and as a result, they have not bred. Now, Lutherans, they do evangelism. It's not like they're not evangelizing to people, and people do convert into Lutheranism. Net conversion rates into Lutheranism, so converts in minus converts out, um, are fairly similar to other Protestant denominations. They might be a little bit lower, but they're not radically different. Gross conversions in are lower, but conversions out are also much lower. So we have higher retention, and which is like exactly what you'd expect, right? But on net, like we're not like hemorrhaging people. Um, so why are we declining when a lot of these other denominations are growing? And the answer is babies.
Mm,
We have small family sizes. Now, it'd be great if we did more evangelism and got more converts. I'd love to see that. We can do more. I have a paper right now that's going to publish this year where I have exhaustively explored the empirical plausibility of a Lutheran revival in America. And I conclude that it's not as implausible as people might think. One
thing I would say, there's this whole flight from evangelicalism that's going on, and it used to be, let's just say 15 years ago, that people who converted out of evangelicalism, a lot of them became Catholics. So you had a lot of intellectual type people who ended up in the Catholic Church, and a lot of political conservatives who are Catholics are converts from that. So there was kind of this pipeline to Rome. Well, now Rome is kind of discredited because of the abuse scandals, and also because of Pope Francis is viewed as kind of very sketchy. So you've seen, I think, just again, this is just my gut feel, that people were going to Eastern Orthodoxy, and if they don't want to go to Orthodoxy route, or there's still some Catholicism, they're looking for denominations. So it used to be people would call themselves Presbyterians. Now Anglican is the flavor of the month. You have all these people who call themselves Anglicans who have no traditional connection whatsoever to Anglicanism. Yeah. But I have met a few people who said, I started attending an LCMS church just because they thought that was the solid church in their area. I think there's a number of evangelicals
kind of like search for solidity,
right,
in Protestant or in Christianity. It has benefited various denominations. So far, that wave has not hit Lutheran in great numbers yet. And I will say there's a lot of Lutherans that are hoping it will never hit. And not because they don't want to grow, but because if you talk to a lot of sort of, committed Presbyterian PCA folks or Orthodox people, a lot of them will not talk about these former evangelicals in glowing terms.
No, the confessionalist Presbyterians,
they showed up. They showed up looking for tradition, and instead they destroyed tradition, right?
Right.
And I will say, I would be remiss if I did not mention that there are some conservative Lutherans who would point to me as a shining example of why you really should not hope that more evangelicals convert to Lutheranism, because I'm terrible and awful and all these things.
Right. So I certainly see, you look at this like new Anglican church in North America, it's essentially a denomination of all converts, in a sense, and therefore I think it's going to have a very odd culture.
Right.
To it on that account. It's not going to be really
that wave has not hit LCMS yet. And I got to say, there's LCMS folks, there's some mixed feelings about it. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's fine. But I don't think it's a substitute for proclaiming the gospel to non-believers and to enabling Christian families to achieve their family desires, which is usually 3 or 4 kids among churchgoers. That's what most churchgoers say they want.
And you would think if you have the institutions like schools and all that provides the infrastructure. That provides the infrastructure for bigger figure. But
that is exactly what you would think.
Yeah, but it doesn't work that way. So we've been going a long time, so I only got one final question for you today. What do you think about the fact that the best known Lutheran in America is Nadia Bolz-Weber?
She's not the best known Lutheran in America.
Who's the best known Lutheran in America?
She's not a Lutheran. I will not pass judgment on any further what she may be theologically, whatever, but she's not a Lutheran. I'm sorry. She's not.
Okay.
I'm not sorry. Why am I apologizing? She's not. I don't even, does she still actually identify?
She was an ELCA ordained priest, as I recall.
I'm aware of that. And my view of the ELCA.
All right. So maybe on a better note, is there any final thoughts about Lutheranism? Give me one optimistic prediction about Lutheranism for America.
One optimistic prediction about Lutheranism for America. I'll give you 2. One is, despite decline, changes in the educational market, global demography, and the publishing industry mean that it is going to be possible, even with a plausibly pessimistic scenario for the LCMS and for Wells, they're going to remain big enough to maintain between them a publishing house and a large-scale conservative seminary for the entire 21st century. Okay? What that means is, and a lot of denominations aren't. Many denominations are not going to maintain that scale. Mm-hmm. Because the pace of their decline is too big, or they're too small, or whatever, or they don't have enough international people to recruit from, or whatever. Lutheranism is going to still be here in 2100, and still going to be here on a scale big enough to do institutional stuff. Which means my belief is that a lot of other denominations are going to collapse in this century. They're just going to be gone. They're just not going to be able to keep going. They're going to fold. People are going to need to sort into other denominations. I think Lutheranism is going to be one of the last man standing situations. I think LCMS is, partly because, as I said, not a lot of people convert out. And so we tend to retain a lot of people, partly because Lutheranism has weathered so many more storms than this. Partly because I believe it is true, and the gates of hell will not prevail against Christ's church. And partly because the data bears it out. The relative size, pace of decline, market size of all this, it's gonna last. That's my first optimistic thing. And I know that sounds pessimistic a bit, but like, it's optimistic. Something will still be here. And this is one of the reasons why I won't get into that, but yes, it's going to last. Secondly, the potential for a demographic revival of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is, I would not say it is inevitable. It is not, but it is not implausible. When you actually, and I've done this, when you actually do all the modeling of like birth rates and conversion rates and mortality rates and confirmation rates and all these different things, and you do all the math, the amount of change in conversion rates, birth rates, retention rates, and stuff like that you would actually need in order for the church to cease its decline and within a few decades resume growth is well within plausibility. Mm-hmm. It doesn't require achieving anything that is not already being done by some other denomination today. And I want to say, one of your commenters here has said, I don't see Calvinism or Lutheranism taking root outside their historic demographics. When Germans were showing up in America in huge numbers, and Lutheranism was growing basically by just standing on the docks and saying, hey, you're Lutheran. There are more immigrants from Lutheran backgrounds arriving today than there were at that time. Okay? They just aren't white. They're Ethiopian, they're Tanzanian, they're Malagasy, they're Indian, they're Indonesian, they're Japanese, okay, not many Japanese, but like Indonesian, Indian, Tanzanian, Malagasy, South African, Brazilian, all these places. Like there are a very large number of Lutherans in the world. And a lot of them are in countries that migration to the US is rising from. And so the idea that like the US population is changing in such a way that Lutheranism will have a hard time taking root. No, we're like getting tons of Lutheran immigrants all the time. All you have to do is go find, is figure out which of these immigrant groups is local to your area, figure out what language they speak, then contact the Lutheran church that you are in fellowship with in that country. Say, we will sponsor a visa for a pastor who speaks that language. We will pay for him to get English language education. We will provide him a church to organize a congregation in. Please send him. We will pay him 15 times what he is being paid in your denomination. It will still cost us 40% less than hiring an American pastor. And I know like people are going to be like, oh, immigration, taking American jobs. Good luck finding an American who speaks like, I don't know. Actually, we have a problem right now. Our church here has tons of Urdu speakers. Good luck finding a Lutheran pastor who speaks Urdu.
Right.
right? Like it's like even we were doing a funeral for a member, and just to get the bulletin translated into Urdu, we had to like put out a call through the denomination, like, can somebody speak Urdu to help us with this?
Right.
Like, so what we need to be doing is sponsoring a bunch of visas to bring pastors from the home countries, just like we did in the 19th century. Um, uh, um, and 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 then use that to contact migrants from these countries and say, hey, you're already Lutheran, or if you're not Lutheran, you're familiar with it and you're aware of it, and usually has a good reputation for education. And you say, look, you're Lutheran. We have a Lutheran school. We're organizing a Lutheran congregation with a pastor that speaks your language.
Well, there
It'll
you go.
work.
There you go. Well, on that note, we just hit the 2 hour mark. So we went a little over even the time I invited you on the calendar. But thank you very much for the stimulating discussion, and best of luck up there for the rest of the winter in Montreal. Let's hope the truckers don't come your way.
Good to talk to you. Always glad to be
All
with
right.
you.
Right. Bye-bye.